So, tracking oceanic sharks in a changing world. I'm going to speak about three things. Firstly, how do we track oceanic sharks? Secondly, how do the oceanic sharks interact with fisheries? And I'll give you some idea of why that's important. And lastly, how a changing world, how will climate change potentially alter that interaction between sharks and fishing? But before I get into that, I've just got to say that research, of course, doesn't happen with one person, not this kind of research anyway. There's a huge team behind this work and has been for the last sort of 30 years that I've been doing it. And there's just a few of them here. This is what a research group looks like these days, or at least over the last sort of 18 months. People in little boxes on computer screens waving and talking to each other. So this is just to introduce the researchers in my team, whose work actually is what I'm speaking about. So when I say I mean we, and when I say we, I mean they. And particularly Nuno Queiroz, Nick Humphreys, Marisa Vador here, and Gonzalo. I'll be talking about their work. So tracking oceanic sharks in a changing world. What are oceanic sharks? Well, these are these incredible species of shark that are generally large, highly mobile, often fast swimming, like this short fin mako shark here, can get up to about 40 miles an hour when chasing down prey. And they're oceanic because they occur for most of their time, for most of their annual cycle, for most of their lives. They're out in over deep water, thousands of meters deep in the open ocean, often away from continental shelf edges and continental shelves themselves. Occasionally, during the annual cycle, during a migration, they may come into these sort of shallower areas. But generally speaking, their world is out there in the open ocean. And here's the blue shark. This is a circumglobal species, and it's widely regarded as the sort of most sort of wide-ranging shark. It's the one that sort of is perhaps the most highly migratory of all of them. So the ocean basin of, let's say, the Atlantic is the sort of home range of this kind of animal. So short fin mako sharks and blue sharks, these are our sort of archetypal oceanic sharks. And I'll give you some idea in this talk as to why it's important to study them. But firstly, how can we study them? I mean, if you go shark watching, this is mostly what you'll see. This sort of undulating, sort of mirrored plane, which is really hard to see beneath. And for most of the time, you won't see anything. And what we've got to do if we want to make sustained observations of the sharks, where they're going, then the movements they're making, where they spend their time, where they prefer to spend their time, and what the environment is where they are, then clearly we have to penetrate this mirrored surface and get an insight into their lives. And what we've been doing in our group and lots of other groups around the world is not only using but developing technology which will allow us a window into the secret lives of these sharks that spend most of their time well away from land masses. And here are a few of the tags. Hopefully you can see my little sort of arrow here, the cursor sort of whizzing around. But we can fit tags to the fins of these sharks. And when the shark breaks the surface of the sea, it transmits a signal which can be picked up by polar orbiting satellites. And from that, we can determine where they are. Obviously, if they stay down deep, then we're not going to know. And so there are other tags which actually record depth and temperature and light. And after a pre-programmed time, they pop up. So they pop off the shark and then float to the surface. This is what they look like. They're sort of a little karaoke microphone. They pop up to the surface and then they start transmitting. And from the light level data, we can actually determine where on the Earth's surface that tag has been. And so that gives us a sort of a way of reconstructing the tracks of these sharks. More recently, we've seen tags which can record the body movements of sharks as well, how many tail beats the shark does, how fast it's moving, its compass heading as well. And I'll get onto some of those sort of newer technologies towards the end of the talk. But we've been using the technology, that sort of pop-up technology of transmitting tags for the last sort of 20 plus years, 22 years. This was some of our first studies on the amazing planktivorous basking shark. And these were some of the, at the time, these were the first sort of long-term trackings of any shark species. And we attached them to basking sharks off Plymouth here. You can see this red dot. That was what we tagged actually just outside of Plymouth Sound that I'm looking out across now from the MBA lab on Plymouth Hoe. And within a few months, it was off Western Scotland. It had moved very quickly out along the shelf edge. And then we went to Scotland that same year and tagged some sharks there, some basking sharks there. And they had, at the end of the sort of summer, they were then moving back through the Irish Sea and down into sort of warmer, sort of southern waters. So incredible technology that's sort of 20 odd years old, but it's still the sort of workhorse of how we study sharks at sea in these far-flung locations. As I mentioned, not only can we detect using these tags, relaying signals up to these polar orbiting satellites, we can get location and direction and behavior, the foraging range of these animals, where they've moved to, where they like to hang out. We can also get diving data. And from some of the newer tags, we can also get even feeding rate information as they make their surges towards prey that they encounter. The tags also measure environmental variables. You can see salinity, temperature, and as I'll mention at the end of the talk, also a tag we've just developed that measures dissolved oxygen, and I'll tell you why that's important. So lots of different tags recording all sorts of different things, not only about what the shark might be doing, but what the environment looks like. And from that, we can find out a lot about what motivates sharks to go where they go, what drives them to do certain things at certain times. And the blue shark, this is one of the ones we've been studying and tracking for the longest. This is one that we've studied since about 2006, when we first started tagging them in the English Channel, actually. And here's a tag attached to the fin of a blue shark. And here are several blue sharks. Actually, these are in the English Channel, and this one's in the Azores. And tagging blue sharks, this highly migratory species, soon becomes an ocean basin scale study. And here are some tracks that we've reconstructed from either direct satellite tracking or from pop-up satellite tags. Here in these sort of dark red circles here, these are blue sharks. The orange ones are short-fin mako sharks, and the white ones are tiger sharks. And what we can see from the blue shark ones is that at certain times they come up into the shelf areas around the UK. And that's very interesting because normally they spend most of their time out in these oceanic areas over very deep water. But during the summer, they make a foraging or feeding migration into UK shelf waters. And these sharks generally are female subadult blue sharks, and they're migrating to feed on these aggregating silvery fishes, herring and mackerel, that occur in great schools in the summertime. And if we start to group these tracks together, so over a number of years, we're tracking different individuals that we've tagged in different places, then we can start to build up a picture of what they do seasonally. How does the tagged population of blue sharks change their distribution seasonally? And if we start off in winter, you can see here that this is a heat map. So where there's sort of warmer colors, that's more locations from our satellite tags. And there's a few hundred blue sharks that have been tagged here. And we can see that over time in the winter, they're generally further south. But as spring comes along, in the northern latitudes, the water starts to warm up, the sharks start to increase their northerly range edge, their northerly extent. And in high summer, June through to August, we see that that's when they're occurring mainly in sort of UK waters, but they're also moving further south as well. Larger individuals tend to move, make these sort of southerly migrations down off Africa. And I'll talk about those in a few moments' time. But then when we get back into sort of autumn, going into winter, we see that generally they're at a high northern extent, but gradually there are others which are moving back into this more central location of the Atlantic. So seasonally, we see that blue shark distributions are like a pulsing heart, really. They start off in the south and then they pulse up into these northern areas to feed, generally feeding migrations before moving back further south to where they're breeding in these warmer waters year round. But of course, in those movements, those migrations that they're making either seasonally or in daily movements, they are also in areas where there are fishing vessels. And this is a longline fishing vessel operating in the Atlantic, the North Atlantic Ocean. And we can start to think not only about tracking the sharks, but tracking the fishing vessels as well. And we can see that here. Here was a shark that we tagged off Cornwall here. Actually, we went out about 20 miles off of Plymouth. We tagged this one with a pop-up tag that I showed you, and we tracked it through the autumn and into the winter, where it spent its time along the north Spanish coast here, before moving up into this area here in the Bay of Biscay. This blue line here, these dots are the deployments of the long lines that this vessel is making, or a vessel like this. And these long lines are about 100 kilometers long with about 1,200 baited hooks. And they're usually deployed at night, and they soak for the nighttime and are collected in again during the day. And this deployment here caught our tagged blue shark. So here we have interactions between a tagged shark and a tracked fishing vessel. This is tracked using the vessel monitoring system. And what these longliners are catching, historically, the target species has been swordfish, such as this, and tuna, these higher value species. But over the last couple of decades, 2 or 3 decades, the blue shark and the shortfin mako shark have become commercially important to these longline fishing vessels. And in the Atlantic at any one time, there are hundreds of these vessels deploying these lines. It's not really a seasonal thing. There are lines going in every day, every week, every month throughout the year. It's a 24-hour monthly, yearly fishery. And the blues and the makos together make up about 90% of the pelagic, these sort of large sort of surface dwelling sharks make up about 90% of all of the pelagic sharks that are caught worldwide, and especially in the Atlantic. They're particularly important commercially. And really what's happened is that the vessels over the last 50 years have obviously increased in size. After the Second World War, there was an increase in the technology available, refrigeration, pathfinding capabilities, reliable diesel motors, and the vessels have got larger, and they've been able to reach much further into this oceanic realm. And you can see from this plot here, again, it's a heat map, so the warmer colors mean that there's more area exploited. There's latitude here and time along the bottom. So generally what we see, there are more of the ocean is being exploited. There's an expansion of the fisheries across the global ocean through time, and particularly in the last 30 years, but originating from the 1950s, particularly in the last 30 years. And it's in those 30 years that more sharks, more pelagic sharks have been caught as markets have developed for not only the fins, but also the meat as well. And what we can see over that half century, since about 1970, is that there's been a global decline in the oceanic sharks and rays. And you can see this whether you sort of splice it by ocean. The Atlantic Ocean's seen a decrease, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, whether you do it by habitat, all the trends are telling us that the direction is down. There's been a decline in these species. And so here are some silhouettes. If we pick out the short fin mako that I mentioned earlier, that's seen about a 40% decline in the relative abundance. If we look at the blue shark, you can see that there, that's about 30% decline over that 50-year period. So the expansion of the fisheries, the more intensive fishing in certain places, there has been this decline in relative abundance, which has been attributed to overfishing. So too many vessels taking in and landing, so high fisheries-induced mortality of sharks, too higher fishery-induced mortality, leading to this decline over these Atlantic and Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean areas. And so about 5 years ago, we realized that there was a missing piece in the puzzle of trying to understand how to best manage these high seas areas. The high seas areas, of course, are a global commons, and they are managed. The tuna and the swordfish and other species are managed. And those regional fisheries management organizations for tuna are also responsible for sharks. And what was happening was that management for sharks, even though the declines were being recorded, management was very slow to come in. And even measures that have been brought in have been rather small rather small in comparison to the big effect that we're seeing in terms of the decline. So about 5 years ago, myself and others decided to draw scientific information of shark movements globally together, because improving management requires resolving not only where fisheries are, where they're operating, but also where the sharks are. And understanding how these overlap, the degree to which they overlap, is crucial to improving the management, because you can't manage something if you don't know where it is. And so the satellite tags that I mentioned to you, these ones here, or even a GPS tag like this one, they give us a fisheries independent measure of where sharks are. Because if you're just relying on landings data or catch data from vessels, that doesn't tell you where the vessel, what's happening where the vessels aren't. In other words, we want to know if there are shark refuges out there where there are lots of sharks, where the fishing vessels aren't going. So 5 years ago, we brought together about 40 different research groups from across 26 different countries, led here from Plymouth, from the MBA laboratory in Plymouth. And the first analysis that we did was to look at where all those global sharks were going. And you can see here, this is from one of our first papers published in 2019. And you can see the different colors relate to different species. So the orange here are great white sharks of South Africa and of California. The blue is blue sharks in the Atlantic. And we also see this yellow color here. These are salmon sharks, very closely related to our own porbeagle shark. And we gathered all the tracks together to pretty much try and find out, where do sharks like to hang out? Where is it that they prefer to be? And you can see here that mako sharks are in these areas in the Atlantic, the Pacific, and also in the Indian Ocean as well. Obviously, there are areas where we haven't tracked them. That doesn't mean the sharks aren't there. It's just that we haven't managed to get to those locations yet, or link up with researchers in the countries bordering these oceans. And that's something we're aiming to do in the next 5 years. In our next 5 year sort of life as part of this project, the Global Shark Movement Project. And what we found from looking at the sharks where they like to hang out, we also started to look at where the fishing effort was happening. So this is a global map of longline fishing effort as measured by the automatic identification system, which is an anti-collision system on vessels mandated for vessels above 300 tons. But often smaller vessels, smaller fishing vessels will also use AIS such that they hopefully then don't collide with other vessels as part of their movements around the ocean. But what you can see here is that there, again, a heat map. So hotter colors refer to mean that there's more fishing effort. And you can see that there are hot spots of fishing. If we look at the Atlantic, there are warmer colors off West Africa here. In the central Atlantic, where we were seeing a lot of those makos and blue sharks hanging out, we also found that there were lots of fishing effort going on. You can see along the shelf edge, if we just sort of look in bit more detail, you'd have to squint and move closer to your screens for this one. You can see that along the shelf edge of the UK and Ireland, there are also hotspots of fishing. If we go out into the Pacific, you can see that here are the big sort of hotspots of fishing for tuna mainly. And in the Indian Ocean, off Madagascar and South Africa, and in the Western Pacific here of these Pacific islands. So there are definite hotspots and also little halos here around these exclusive economic zones of particular countries where these vessels don't go necessarily into unless they have an agreement with that country. So as you can see from here, the longline fishing effort, these large vessels plying the oceanic sort of areas, the high seas areas, aren't necessarily everywhere. But what we want to know is, do they occur where the sharks do? And what we found was that actually there's a very, very high overlap of longline fishing vessels and sharks and pelagic sharks. And you can see here that these, again, heat map, hotter, white hot means that there's really strong overlap between hotspots of sharks and hotspots of fishing effort. And you can see that in the central Atlantic here, where the Gulf Stream meets the cold Labrador Current. You get this high productivity, and that's where tiger sharks and shortfin mako sharks and blue sharks like to hang out. And lo and behold, that's where the fishing vessels target their activity for swordfish tunas, but also sharks. And sharks are targeted by these vessels now. And we see that there's about a 24% overlap per month between sharks and longliners, and that can be up to 76% for our blue sharks in the Atlantic. And there's also high mortality where you see this high overlap. So we did a whole bunch of other calculations using catch data. So what we find is that the shark hotspots are associated with significant increases in fishing effort, but also that there's fishing-induced mortality is greater where the overlap is greater. So where you've got a higher intensity of overlap, where the sharks are hanging out in the fishing vessels, then there's higher mortality. And worryingly, actually, only about, well, less than 25% of high sea shark hotspots are free from this longline fishing effort. So very much the tracked pelagic sharks that we've looked at so far, they seem to have quite limited spatial refuge from current levels of high seas longline fishing. As I mentioned, the management for most of these shark species we've been talking about is non-existent. It's starting to come into the Atlantic now, but very slowly. And mako sharks, even though they're listed as endangered species globally, there is very little management controlling the catch rates in the Atlantic. And this is very worrying for their population levels, their population status. But as well as fishing, obviously the environment is changing. Climate is changing, the seas are warmer. So off Plymouth here, for example, it's about 1.2 degrees warmer off here than it was about 100 years ago when the MBA lab first started taking records of not only temperature, but zooplankton and fishes. So the climate is changing. How is that warming affecting the ocean, and how might that interact with sharks and fishing activity? Well, as the ocean is warming and there's increased stratification, changing circulation in the ocean, there is what's termed global open ocean deoxygenation. The ocean is losing oxygen. And this is a problem, of course, for water-breathing animals, animals that pass water across gills to extract oxygen, because if there's less oxygen, potentially this may reduce the habitat available to these species. What we find in the ocean is that there are already permanent oxygen minimum zones that occur naturally. as part of the interaction between increased stratification seasonally or persistently in an annual cycle in certain areas. You can see them here highlighted in red and pink. These are areas where there's low oxygen, hypoxic waters, which occur naturally due to the stratification, the low ventilation of oxygenated waters at depth, and also increased microbial respiration in sort of mid-waters. And we find these are termed oxygen minimum zones. But what we find is that with the changing climate, that these oxygen minimum zones are expanding. So this blob of hypoxic water is getting bigger. This volume is increasing. And so for our sharks, they may be in a situation where an expanding oxygen minimum zone, you can see that in this schematic here, there's increasing hypoxia at depth. So this may act as a barrier to sharks, which obviously breathe water and extracts oxygen from the water. This may mean that the habitat that is available to them is reduced. And it could be, and we hypothesize, that this may increase the vulnerability to surface longlining vessels or surface fishing vessels. The analogy being that if there's shooting fish in a barrel is easier if the volume and the depth of the water is less. It could be also a habitat trap, because if the sharks are limited in the depths they can go to due to this expanding low oxygen water, then the prey species that they feed on, fishes and cephalopods, squids and octopuses, may also be limited to that surface layer. And this could mean that the sharks end up spending more time in these regions. And this is something that we've been investigating for the last few years, but also in a new project that's just been funded by the European Research Council to our lab here. And we're asking this question about, are they caught in the middle? And so for the last few slides of my talk, I just want to give you a bit of a taster of some of the new work we've been doing, trying to understand how fisheries and climate change, changing climate of the ocean, is interacting. So are the sharks caught in the middle, expanding hypoxia at depth and increased vulnerability from fishing above? So a few years ago, we started, as I mentioned, tagging blue and short-fin mako sharks all across the Atlantic. And we found that some of these sharks actually migrated south and moved into these, or into the waters above these oxygen minimum zones. And they tended, some of them at least, tended to stay in these regions. And we are very intrigued as to why they did that. Why were they wanting to spend time in the waters above these hypoxic areas? And one of our initial ideas was that these were very productive waters. As I mentioned, we hypothesized that there may be prey which were aggregating in these surface waters as well. So we started to analyze these tracks. And one thing that we found, first of all, was that the dives of blue and short-fin mako sharks were incredibly deep, much deeper than we thought before. Not necessarily in those oxygen minimum zones, but in the adjacent areas as they were migrating through the central Atlantic into those areas, blue and short-fin mako sharks were diving incredibly deep. And I don't know if you can see it here on your screens, but these dives, these deeper ones here, are over 1,400 meters deep. So 1.4 kilometers that blue shark was diving to. This mako shark here was diving to nearly 1.5 kilometers down. And not just doing it once, but doing it every other day. So diving deep. And obviously the question is, diving through the twilight zone into completely dark waters below 1,000 meters, into what's called the midnight zone. So what were the sharks doing down there? And how was low oxygen affecting that incredible vertical dive extent? Well, we started to look at where the dives were happening. So here you can see a shark that was in adjacent water, so was migrating south, was encountering the oxygen minimum zone, where its dive seemed to become shallower, started to shoal, and then moved out of that area and went, again, the dive started getting a little deeper again. Here you can see generally the dives were a bit shallower, but then became deeper outside of that area as the oxygen increased at depth. But you can see that blue sharks in particular, they necessarily weren't completely limited to these surface waters. They were able to make dives into these hypoxic waters. And generally what we find is that it's not necessarily the time at depth that changes too much. Here we see that mostly they're spending 100% less than 500 meters. The oxygen minimum zone is starting at about sort of 100 meters depth to about sort of 800 meters. So they're clearly encountering low oxygen, but it's the maximum dive that they do, or at least the frequency of those maximum dives that is affected by this low oxygen water. So we see a shallower maximum daily dive depth above the oxygen minimum zone. And I don't want to get into the sort of details of what this model shows, but if we just take the take-home message is sort of in this bit here. If we see that this is declining oxygen at depth at 100 meters. So if we just take that level of the ocean and what's going on, what's the oxygen level in that at that depth, we see that as we move across our oxygen minimum zone, or as the shark is moving down or changing position as it moves across the oxygen minimum zone, we find that lower oxygen occurs at the same depth. So as it gets into the center part of the oxygen minimum zone, then we see low oxygen. And what we see there is that you can see that the dive depth gets shallower. So as it moves into the oxygen minimum zone, the dives that it's making are getting shallower. And that's not only due to dissolved oxygen, low dissolved oxygen at depth, it's also due to warmer temperatures at the surface. So it's getting warmer above these oxygen minimum zones, very strong stratification. So warm at the top, warm layer at the top, cold at the bottom, and also an increase in the productivity. So we've got a whole bunch of factors, physical and biological factors influencing what the shark does. And just in my last few slides here, just to say that the sharks are spending time in this area, which is productive, it's warm at the surface, and they're limited to the vertical extent to which they go. But if we look at where the longline fishing vessels are, again, heat map, warmer colors mean that there are more long lines being put in per unit area. We see that there are fishing hotspots along the northern boundary and southern boundary and in the center part of the oxygen minimum zone of West Africa, this eastern tropical Atlantic oxygen minimum zone. And the fishing effort hotspots are above the oxygen minimum zone there on that northern, but there's also a greater fishing intensity. And if we look at the sharks that are being caught in that area, what we find if we take transects across here, this is data of how many blue sharks were caught by commercial longline fishing vessels in that area of West Africa. We see that as the oxygen declines, in other words, as we get into areas which are more hypoxic, then the peak of the fishing vessels make peak catches of blue sharks. So it looks like the catches peak as DO declines most sharply, particularly in this northern part. And this really suggests the potential for overfishing of habitat compressed sharks. The boundary of this hypoxic water may be aggregating sharks into hotspots, which are also good for foraging opportunities for the sharks. So they may be caught in this habitat trap. And my last couple of slides just gives you an idea of the sorts of technology that we're developing with my colleagues Nuno Queiroz and his team at Cibio at the University of Porto in Portugal. They've developed this tag which will record dissolved oxygen. And of course, the oxygen that I've been showing you in those maps, along with the shark movements and the fishing vessels, is actually modeled oxygen. It's from these very complex oceanographic and climate models. And so what the shark's actually experiencing as it's diving might be different to what's been modeled, which is, of course, an averaged and interpolated values. So with this tag, which we started deploying actually in the Azores, you can see it here, it can record all sorts of things, not just dissolved oxygen, but the swimming depth and heading of the shark, the temperature of the water, the accelerometry of the body, the rolling and the pitching and the yawing of the body, how many tail beats the shark is doing. And so we're measuring this as sharks are diving through the water. We're measuring oxygen, temperature, and other variables. And we've also developed this video camera tag. And this will really hopefully get us closer to the predator-prey interactions that are happening above those oxygen minimum zones. And this is the video camera here, actually just in the middle. It slots into our tag here. It's only about 4 centimeters long. But here you can see actually a frame from one of the shark cams that we put out just recently in the Azores. And I don't know if you can make that out on your screen, but these are horse mackerel, or scad, looking very scared and trying to avoid the blue shark as it's swimming through the water there during daytime. They're probably safe during daytime. The blue shark mainly hunts at night. So we're using the video camera and the dissolved oxygen tags, this highly developed technology, to give us a window into the world that the sharks are seeing. And what we hope to do with that information is to try to understand better how the sharks will respond to a changing ocean in the future, which of course it will do. Oxygen will continue to be lost from the ocean as it continues warming, and other factors in the ocean also change. And so in 2050, these are the sort of predicted maximum depths of blue sharks off West Africa. And you can see that they're much shallower than in present day. So we think, or we're predicting that the vertical extent will be much less than it is today. And that may increase the vulnerability to the longline fishing. But it's true also that with that more in detail data we're getting from the technology, that we can actually improve our model estimates of the habitat loss that sharks may be facing in the future. We need more physiological and ecological effects to understand those effects on behavior. And we need to measure and incorporate those into our models to really understand that vulnerability. But really, the sort of take-home message when we think about fisheries for sharks, and also with a changing environment, is probably encapsulated in this from one of our recent papers, which is that management measures for threatened pelagic sharks are not only needed now, but also in the light of changes due to climate changes in the ocean. So specifically ones which act to mitigate the effects of ocean deoxygenation, for example, on catch rates, may be required as oceans continue warming. So hopefully, and I think I'm just about there for, about 40 minutes, hopefully that's given you a flavor of the research we've been doing and trying to understand how sharks are not only interacting with their environment, but how they interact with fishers and also with a changing environment going forwards decades, hopefully to understand how it changes decades into the future as well. So I'll leave it there and I'll hand back to Zoe.
Thank you, David. As you can imagine, we've got lots of questions. So if you don't mind unsharing your screen, so we can see you.
I'll do that now.
Fantastic, thank you. So we'll try and get through as many questions as possible, but if you do have any more, everyone, please pop them into the chat. So the first question is it just longline fishing that poses the biggest threat, or are there other types of fishing equally bad for sharks?
Yeah, it's a good question. Longline fishing is something that we focused on mainly because that's in the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic. That's the main sort of high seas fishery that poses a problem to sharks. But of course, there are others. Purse seine fishing, which is where a seine net, a massive seine net, is drawn around a school of tunas, for example, also catches sharks. And that's very prevalent in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And in fact, in that paper I mentioned there, we also map the purse seine fishing. And equally, that overlaps with sharks to a very high degree. I didn't have time to show that in the talk. So yeah, purse seine fishing is a problem for our pelagic sharks as well as longline fishing.
And do you find that both or all of your sharks that attract, do they get caught equally by the lines and the nets, or is there sort of a difference?
Yeah, there is. There has been more management of purse seine fisheries generally for sharks. So we see fewer sharks caught in purse seine fisheries than longlines. So in that example I showed there of all those, well, nearly 2,000 sharks that we tracked there, you know, probably about 10 to 20% of short fin makos, about 20% of short fin makos were caught. So even our satellite tagged ones, about 20 to 30% were caught within the lifetime of the project by longline fishing, and also some great white sharks by net fishing as well in more sort of shelf areas off South Africa, for example.
Interesting. The next question is, I've been snorkeling with blue sharks out of Cornwall previously and plan to again in the next couple of weeks. What is your opinion of using chum or bait to attract sharks in UK waters? Do you think it has a negative impact?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. There's actually a good scientific literature on, actually growing, a burgeoning literature on whether sort of baiting and chumming, it's called, in sort of ecotourism terms, it's called provisioning, shark provisioning. And this obviously has been going on a long time off California. I mean, it's banned there now. But off South Africa, for example, and in the Bahamas in particular, they have shark provisioning for tiger sharks at Tiger Beach, for example. In Fiji as well, there are ecotourist operations. And there are studies which indicate that they can have an effect. In other words, that they can result in sharks actually remaining in that area longer than they perhaps would have otherwise. But there's also other evidence to suggest that provisioning, at least in certain seasons, so either the wet or the dry season, for example, doesn't have a longer term impact on the foraging opportunities, on growth rates and so on of sharks. So I think it rather depends where you are and what species. I think for blue sharks, obviously, blue sharks have been caught by sport angling for decades, since about the 1950s. Sport angling became very popular, or was made popular by more people having leisure time and so on off the southwest. The Loo Angling Club, for example, is obviously is famous, world famous for catching over those decades blues and makos and things. And obviously, chum was used to attract sharks to the area. Has that had a long-term effect? I doubt that it has very much, actually, simply because the rate at which blue sharks are being caught in areas away from the UK, so in those offshore areas, those oceanic areas, is probably much, much higher.
Certainly useful to be aware of the impacts, isn't it? Especially with your kind of research. I imagine it affects sort of the way you're tracking the sharks as well.
Yeah, you tend to find that blue sharks, I mean, they will hang around a particular area if they think that food is there. They're very curious animals, very curious animals, and but actually the blue shark, it's all about movement. It moves on. Mm. It's always moving. I mean, we've tracked them and they're moving sort of 70 kilometers a day on average. They always just keep moving. It's sort of, I hate to use the sort of Finding Nemo, the Dory thing, keep on moving, but it does seem like that, especially when you see the videos of them from our video tag. It's just endless blue and they're just carrying on. Obviously, when they find something, they will circle back, and you have this thing called area restricted searching. And so that's what happens in the ecotourist situations. But as soon as the ecotourists, the provisioning stops, then the blue sharks generally will move on after a short time.
Fascinating. So the next question is, are you able to share your research with the fishing industry, and is there any chance of them working towards more sustainable methods? And a sort of second part to that question, by asked by someone else, is how do you avoid fishermen taking advantage of the increased knowledge of shark locations? So sort of a double barrel that question.
Yeah, it's both a really good question. I get asked them quite a lot, actually, especially the second part, which actually I'll take first, if that's okay, because yes, is it that, for example, us tracking sharks and showing where the hotspots are is news to fishermen, and that will help them to improve their catches? The reality is the fishers are very skilled. They're very smart. These big longline vessels with large crew, the Spanish fleet at least, are usually, the knowledge is passed down in families, and the fishing occurs in families. And so there's a huge knowledge of the regions of the ocean to go to at certain times of the year to catch blue sharks and short fin mako sharks, for example. And so we're not telling them necessarily anything they don't know in terms of the broad areas. Obviously, when they get there, they still have to search because the sharks are moving, and obviously the ocean conditions move. We've actually analyzed the tracks of the vessels in the same way as the sharks, and we've done habitat selection analysis. And in fact, the vessels are occurring in the same habitats that the sharks select. And this is because sharks like to be on boundaries between warm and cold water, or different water masses generally, because they tend to be highly productive. So frontal areas, or areas with particular temperature compared to another set of temperatures, further away. And the fishers do exactly the same, and they're able to do that because they buy satellite images of sea surface temperature. And so they can lay that 100-kilometer long line very accurately across a front, for example. So when they get there, they're searching, and you can see that in the track. When they're not catching so much, you see that their track is very linear. But if you go back to that one I showed at the start, you start to see that sort of starfish pattern, that star pattern. That means they're getting good catches because they then put the line in more or less where they've put it last. So you can actually tell their behavior, how well they're doing from the track. So actually, in broad terms, our publications have quite coarse maps, and we keep it like that. We don't make the raw data available. We have quite coarse scale maps. And in fact, the fishers already know the areas to go to. The first part of the question was about, can we interact with the fishers? And in fact, that's what we do. This research we've been doing, where we've been tagging across the Atlantic, couldn't have been done without working with commercial longliners, for example. And it's fascinating to hear how they feel about the fishing that goes on, the fishing that they're doing, because actually, for many of the species, they wish management was actually tighter. And the fishermen themselves actually want to be sustainable. They want to be able to catch blue and short fin mako sharks and sell the fins and the meat to make profit, to feed their workers and their families and so on. And what's happening actually at the sort of national level of these tuna regional fisheries management organizations is that there's not agreement on the management measures to take. So at the individual sort of vessel level, when you're talking to a skipper, they're actually very amenable to management, which may surprise some people to learn, but it's true. And in fact, they've given us their logbooks. All that catch data I showed at the end there was from the logbooks of the Spanish longlining fleet, and they gave that to us and said, look, if it's useful in your research, please have it, because we've given this to the national body as well. So you may as well have it. And so I think it's at that international level of where politics and economics, which is essentially, conservation of natural resources is about economics and politics. That's where it sort of seems to end up for sharks, at least, and probably other animals. It seems to be at that sort of level that the management is sticking. And that's obviously, for short fin mako, is becoming very crucial now. Management has been brought in just in the last couple of years, which is live release. So anything alive alongside has to be released. But it looks like that at least some nations necessarily aren't reporting all of the catches they're making, or may not be releasing all of the sharks that they encounter. So there may be problems at the individual vessel level, but that largely is driven by the national level and the member states that contribute to these fisheries management organizations. So it's very complex, and that requires another lecture, I think.
Well, no, I appreciate you going into detail about that. And it's important to know where the conservation issue lies. And it sounds like if you've got the individuals on board, then there's certainly hope for changes in management as well?
There is. I guess that's one thing, actually. Obviously, in this talk, you may be thinking, oh, it's all doom and gloom and so on. But actually, it's not, because the researchers are coming together and they're meeting with fishers and management organizations. The last 10 years has been incredibly productive, actually. We've moved a real long way very quickly. The advent of grouping this data together, sharing data more than we were before, it really makes me as a scientist very optimistic that we can get to where we need to be to make these sorts of commercial fishing of these sharks sustainable. But we've got to the catches have got to be way less than they are at the moment. And so there does have to be a step change.
That's great to hear. And the next question is a bit of a curveball to the other side of your research, is what happens to the tags when they come off the sharks?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. So all the tags, so the tags I mentioned here are released and they pop off, and the little bit that's left in the bottom of the fin of the shark will actually dissolve, and so won't leave, over time, won't leave any marks or injuries or anything like that. These tags actually float and will eventually will pitch up on beaches. And in fact, I've got one just up on my shelf there that spent 14 years at sea. I attached it to a basking shark, actually, just off here, off the Sound here at Plymouth. And it was retrieved by someone walking their dog 14 years later on a beach in West Scotland. And it was returned. It's got a name and address on it. Please return to, and there's a reward for the finder as well, of course. So when you're out there, keep your eyes peeled for things like this, little karaoke microphones, and you never know, you could get some money coming your way in the post. The other sorts of tags, the ones that are fitted to the fin of the shark, they actually have, they're designed to attach for longer, 1 to 2 years. And after that time, the pins that are used will dissolve, and the tag will be shed and it will sink. Yeah.
There's a long-lived project then. Lots of years.
Yeah, these pop-up ones are fascinating. I mean, these are electronic messages in bottles, essentially, and they're floating out there. As you saw a big tabletop full of them that I showed in the talk. They're going to be out there. So keep your eyes peeled. Will
do. So the next, and I believe the last question is, it seems that blue shark are more common off Devon from snorkel trips offered. Is this climate driven or some other driver?
Good question. It's a really good question, because on hearing my talk, you might think, hold on a minute, that's counterintuitive. When I was off Falmouth Bay the other week, there were loads of these blue sharks swimming around the boat, little ones and sort of larger ones. As I mentioned in the talk, that there is a feeding migration, generally subadult females. There can be males, obviously, and larger ones, but it's generally a subadult migration into the shelf areas for feeding. And what we find is that the number that come into the area varies depending on the food availability. And that's especially to do with how close they are to the shore, which obviously governs how many you're likely to see. Because if most of the fish schools are 40 miles off, then if you only go 10 miles, you're not necessarily going to be able to attract them to the vessel. So we do see that that can vary depending on the food availability and also the location of the food. It does look as though over time, if you go back at this lab, before I was a PhD student here, crikey, that was a while back now, 30 years ago. Before me, 50 years ago, there was someone studying blue sharks then. And they'd found from the tagging they'd done, the blue sharks they'd seen over that period in the 60s and 70s, that actually their occurrence seemed linked to water temperature, which we know as it gets warmer, they come closer. But also that was related to the food availability. And I think that that's right. As that changes, as the local temperature of where that isotherm is, that 15-degree isotherm necessarily for blue sharks, 16-degree isotherm. As that changes position, then that determines where the distribution of those sharks. As I showed, seasonally, they're moving like a pulsing heart in the Atlantic. That will determine how far north they come. And obviously linked into that is food availability. If there's more or less food, that will determine how many is being seen. So that really controls the relative abundance in the hotspot. So what's good off Cornwall at the moment is there are good numbers of blue sharks being seen, but they're drawn from a population that is generally declining across their range in the Atlantic.
Yes, I guess it's important to note that the sort of visibility doesn't necessarily reflect the whole population as well.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, David, for this talk. It's been utterly fascinating, and I've certainly learned a lot. And thank you to all for your questions. I'd just like to say that Devon Wild Trust have been pushing for stronger protection of our seas, specifically highly protected marine areas where marine wildlife has a refuge and a chance to recover for a few years. And we want to thank you if you did sign our petition for highly protected marine areas and helping the sort of decision that earlier this year DEFRA made their kind of decision that they would start installing or creating these highly protected marine areas. So we're sort of waiting to hear about those and where they will be placed. But there's obviously still a lot we can do for marine wildlife. So I would recommend looking at our National Marine Week page and our Take Action web pages on our website. I can send links after the talk, as it's still important to think about what we can do at a personal level. And I can also send links to David's research as well, just to sort of, if you're interested in a bit more depth, he's obviously just skimmed the surface, as it were, to what their team have been doing. So I'd like to thank everyone again for what a fantastic evening, and I hope you enjoy the good weather before it turns a little bit grey and cloudy. So thank you, David, and thank you to you all.